All right, so we're talking about the urinary system, guys. And first, just like the gross anatomy here. We know you have two kidneys. And those are located right in the small of your back. And my board is really, really slow today. But leading away from both of those kidneys, down toward the bladder, is a tube. And we call that tube the ureter. Don't confuse that with the urethra, which we'll get to in a minute. The ureter goes from the kidney to the bladder. Down here's the bladder. And then the bladder empties out of your body through a much shorter tube called the urethra. So we've got two kidneys, a ureter leading from each one of those to the bladder, and then a urethra leading from the bladder to out. A couple of blood vessels to point out while we're here. Your body's main artery, which runs almost like an interstate up and down the trunk of your body, this thing right here. Anybody remember what that big vein is called? Say again? Yeah, the vena cava. Now, in the lower part of your body, it's called what vena cava? Inferior. And above your heart, it's called the superior. But we're just going to call it the vena cava for right now. And then the body's main artery, the one in red here, what's that one called? That's the aorta. Think of it almost like an interstate system. The aorta is an artery. Arteries carry blood in which direction? In terms of your heart, which way do arteries carry it? Away from the heart. And your veins carry it back too. So it's a closed loop. Now, why I point those out is notice that there's a branch off each one of those to each kidney. So there's the artery branches to each kidney. And there's also a vein branch going into each one of your kidneys. And those are called the renal arteries and the renal veins. Whenever you see that word renal, that always means kidney. So the renal arteries take blood to the kidneys, and the renal veins bring it back out to the kidneys. That's the main part of your anatomy. Now, the kidneys have lots of functions. The urinary system in general has lots of functions. But the main one is that right there, osmoregulation, which is the regulation of what? Yeah, water and solute contents of your body fluids, specifically your blood, but other body fluids too. Regulation of the water content and the solute content. Really, really, really important. If that changes, what happens? What happens if there's even a fairly slight change in the solute content of your body fluids? You die. That's what starts happening to you. What happens when your pH changes? Denaturation of proteins. Salinity can do the same thing. So it's not a pretty picture. Think of your kidneys as another one of those organs that help you to maintain what? Homeostasis. Now, your kidneys do a lot of other things. They get rid of waste. There's lots of waste in your body, but the waste material that I want us to concentrate on today are nitrogenous wastes. Nitrogen-containing wastes. So when do we normally make those? When we're digesting what products? Proteins, which we can get from, what's the main source of protein in your diet? Meat, but eggs. Any kind of, like beans have a lot of protein. There's lots of vegetables that have proteins too. And what are proteins made out of? Amino acids. So let's think about that for just a minute. If you can't already draw an amino acid, you need to be able to draw one. That's what an amino acid looks like. Your body's trying to digest this amino acid. It's already broken the proteins down into amino acids. What's it going to do to get rid of this amino acid and get some energy out of it? It's going to rip off what part first? The amino groups, which is this NH2 thing. By the way, what's this group over here called? The COOH group. Carboxyl. It rips off this amino group. And essentially, this leftover part is what? It's an acetyl group, which can be used in what process? Where do we use acetyl groups? Okay, cell respiration. No? The Krebs cycle. That's what goes into the Krebs cycle. And therefore, you get energy out of it, you oxidize it, and then it can be that energy can be used to do electron transport. But the part we're worried about today is not the acetyl group. The part we're worried about today is that amino group. It combines with hydrogen to make that stuff right there, NH3. And what is NH3? It's ammonia. And it's pretty wet. Pretty toxic stuff. And your body has to be able to get rid of it fairly quickly. Now, if you were a fish, right after you made it, what are you going to do? You're going to urinate it out. Just straight up ammonia, pretty much. Some water and some ammonia. Urinate it out real fast. Because as a fish, you're not real concerned about what? Dehydrating. You're not worried about losing your water, so you just urinate out whenever you need to. Now, on the other hand, if you're something like a mammal or an amphibian, will that work for you? That strategy? It won't. So, your liver takes this ammonia and converts it into something a little less toxic, urea. Something that you can store for a little while and hold on to without killing yourself. But that stuff's still toxic, and it's still really soluble in water. So your kidneys filter it out, and eventually you urinate it out. But you don't have to do it the instant you make it. That strategy works okay. But another issue with that strategy is that both of these things, ammonia and urea, are both really soluble in water. So if you're an animal that develops in like a hard-shelled egg, like a reptile or a bird, will that strategy work for you? Nope. Because are those little babies in the egg, are they digesting proteins? Is a little bird in the egg digesting proteins? Yep. And essentially, what would they do to themselves if they were using this strategy? They poison themselves. So instead of doing this strategy, the reptiles and the birds convert the ammonia into something that's not very water soluble, called uric acid. And when that stuff's made, pretty much what it do? It clumps up. What's a more chemistry sounding word for that? Precipitates out of solution. It just sort of hangs out over there on the side. Doesn't hurt the baby. And therefore, when birds or reptiles urinate, it comes out sort of like pasty-like. That white stuff you see from birds is actually urine, not poop. So make sure you know how different kinds of animals get rid of their nitrogenous waste. Fish just urinate out ammonia. Mammals and amphibians, what do we urinate out? Urea. And then the reptiles and the birds use that more insoluble uric acid to get rid of their stuff. All right, let's go a little further here. All right, just facts that we've already mentioned about urine. Pass out about 1.5 quarts per day. That's highly variable depending on what you ate or drink. Normal urine is sterile when it comes out of your body. It doesn't stay that way for very long though. And also your bladder has this mucus-like coating on it that helps to keep you from getting bladder infections. You can still get them, but it's fairly rare. The main thing we're going to focus on today is this thing. This is the nephron. In each one of your kidneys, there's at least 1 million of these things. These are the parts of your kidneys that actually do the work. They're the filters. Sometimes they're called the functional units of the kidney. They filter out things that you don't need, and then they reabsorb things that you do need. And I want to point something out to you. Blood is coming into this nephron through this arteriole. An arteriole is essentially just what? It's a branch of an artery. And those arterioles eventually branch off to make what? Smaller blood vessels. It goes artery to arteriole to capillaries. And then the capillaries fuse back together to make venules. And the venules fuse back together to make veins. It's a loop. Your blood vessels aren't like a one-way street. They're like a circle. It goes from artery to arterial to capillary to venule to vein, and then back to where? Where the veins always take the blood. Back to the heart. It's a closed circuit. So here we have an arteriole coming into the nephron. And once that arteriole gets into this big funnel-shaped thing called the Bowman's capsule, it branches off into a bunch of capillaries. It's hard to see those inside this thing, I know, but they try to make it transparent so you can at least see a little bit. But there's a big bed of capillaries in there. That bed of capillaries is called the glomerulus. And capillaries are sort of famous for being really what? Leaky. You want them to be leaky. And these at the glomerulus are even maybe more leaky than a normal capillary. So blood comes in through this arteriole. It goes into that capillary bed, the glomerulus, and anything that's small that's in those blood vessels does what? Leaves the blood vessel, and it comes out. And it goes into this big funnel-shaped head here. And again, that's called the Bowman's capsule, or you might also see it called the glomerular capsule, because it's around the glomerulus. That's the first step in making urine. It's called filtration. Blood comes into that glomerulus, and essentially anything that's small comes out. That includes things like water, sugars, vitamins, salts, urea. Pretty much anything that's smaller than the cells comes out. Filtration. Some of that stuff you want to get rid of. Some of it you want to urinate out. Some of it you want to keep. But to begin with, it all gets filtered out. Lots of water, lots of sugars, amino acids, glucose, vitamins, waste, urea. All those things come out. They go into that big funnel-shaped head there. That was nice, isn't it? All right. Again, that is called filtration. Step one in making urine, filtration. I think I covered pretty much everything on this slide already, but again, blood comes into the glomerulus, into that big capillary bed. It's really permeable. So anything that's small, you notice it says here less than 60,000 Daltons. What's a Dalton? It's like those red numbers in the periodic table, which you probably have been calling what? AMUs, right? It's another name for an AMU, which is the size of one what? An AMU is the size of one proton or one neutron. So we're talking, this is tiny. Even though it's 60,000 sounds like a lot, it's like 60,000 protons, which is not much at all. Very, very tiny. Here's just a list of some of the things that get filtered out. Water, urea, glucose, salts, amino acids, vitamins. A lot of those, I want you to realize that a lot of that stuff, you don't want to urinate out, right? A lot of that stuff you want to keep. But in step one, it all gets taken out of your blood, it gets filtered out, and now you've got to sort out what you want to keep, what you want to get rid of. And that's step two. Step two is called tubular reabsorption. And before we go through this slide, let's go back to the picture for a second. Now again, everything up here in yellow is the nephron. So far, we've only looked at this glomerular capsule, this Bowman's capsule. That's where filtration happens. But the next part of the tube is this twisty part right in here. And that part of the tube is called the proximal tubule, or sometimes you're going to see it called the proximal convoluted tubule. What's convoluted mean? Twisted, curvy. And proximal means what? Close to. So it's the curvy tube near the glomerulus. That's why it's called the proximal convoluted tubule. The curvy tube near the glomerulus. So the stuff that got filtered out, all those materials that got filtered out of the blood, now go into this proximal tubule. And what's going to happen while it's in the tube, a lot of the stuff that came out of the blood is going to be put back where? Back into the blood. So it's going to leave this tube, and go back into these blood vessels that surround it. That's what we call tubular reabsorption. Most of the tubular reabsorption happens in this proximal part of the tube. Some of it also happens in this big U-shaped loop. What I marked there in blue, that's called the loop of Henle. So those are the two locations that we're going to talk about tubular reabsorption. Again, tubular reabsorption is when things that came out of the blood, like water, and they went into this tube, now are put back into the blood. Things we want to keep are taken out of the tube, put back into the bloodstream. So again, most of the reabsorption occurs in that proximal tubule, some of it in the loop of Henle. And during this process, about 75% of the water that came out of the blood goes back in. And most of that goes back in passively. It just moves back from the tube into the blood through osmosis. So most of the water is taken back in just by straight up diffusion of water. But there are certain things that you want to keep that won't move back in passively. You have to make them go back into the blood. And those are things like glucose, minerals. Those kinds of things are pumped from that tube back into the bloodstream. So we're talking about active transport. We're having to use ATP here to make this happen. So those are things that you need to keep. They're pumped out of the tube, out of that proximal tubule, back into the blood so that you don't lose them, so that you don't urinate them out. Should a normal person urinate out glucose? Well, if you're urinating out glucose, what does that probably mean? You probably got diabetes. There's also a little bit of reabsorption that happens in the tube further upstream called the distal tubule. But most of the reabsorption, step 2 of urine formation, happens in either that proximal tube or in that loop of Henle. I think last time we talked about this animal called the kangaroo rat. A little rat that jumps like a kangaroo. Where does it live? It lives in the desert. Really dry deserts. It very seldom drinks. And one of the reasons it can get by with that is this loop of Henle in the kangaroo rat, proportionally speaking, is like way longer than it is in normal mammals. Which means as the urine is going through it, it's so much longer. What's happening is it's going through that really long loop. What's happening to the urine? Reabsorption of what is happening? Water. So when this thing urinates, it urinates out almost no water. The water is taken out of the urine, put back into the blood, so that it conserves its water. A way to conserve water. The very last part of the urine formation here is called tubular secretion. And we'll come back to this slide in a second. Let's go back to the picture first. Most of the tubular secretion happens in this last part of the tube. And notice we got another curvy section here. And this curvy section of the tube is called the distal tubule, or the distal convoluted tubule. Which again means the curvy part of the tube, far from what? This is far away from where we started, and what did we call where we started? The glomerulus, capillary bed. This last step is called tubular secretion. Let's say you've been drinking something that's really, really acidic, like lemon juice. Theoretically, what could happen to your blood? It could start becoming acidic. What do we know happens to your body if your pH changes by even like a tenth or more? Yeah, you start denaturing proteins and you die. One of the ways that your body maintains pH is through this process of tubular secretion. If your blood is too acidic, that means it has too many of what ions in it? Hydrogens. So to get rid of some of those hydrogens, what your body can do is, notice there's blood vessels that go around this distal tubule. They can actually pump out hydrogen ions from the blood straight into this distal tubule. That's tubular secretion. When things like hydrogen ions or maybe some kind of toxins are pumped from the bloodstream, actively transported from the bloodstream, straight into the distal tubule. By the time we get to the end of this distal tubule, what do we call the liquid in the tube? What do we call the stuff that's left in this yellow tube by the time it gets to here? It's urine. It's finished. So essentially, we're pumping in this tubular secretion step. We're pumping things that we want to get rid of now, like H+, toxins. We're pumping them from the bloodstream directly into what's going to be the urine in just a matter of minutes. So, by the way, what's filtrate mean? It's a word you've probably used in chemistry before. What's filtrate? If you're filtering something, it's the stuff that came through the filter. You poured it into the filter, it's the stuff that came through. So the filtrate is all the stuff that came out, in this context, it's all the stuff that came out of your blood and went into that nephron. When it gets to the distal tube, some things that are still in the blood, we need to get rid of. Like hydrogen ions, like I said before. So hydrogen ions can be secreted from the bloodstream into that filtrate, into the distal tubule, so that we can get rid of them very, very quickly. It's also a way to get rid of waste and toxins and such. So after all that's done, after those 3 steps, which again are filtration, what's step 2? Tubular reabsorption and tubular secretion, we get what's called post-secretion. The stuff that's still in the tube, in that distal part of the tube, it's now called urine. And mostly what's in it is extra salts, sodium, sometimes potassium, depending on what you ate, extra salts that you don't need, some water, hopefully not too much, waste and toxins, and urea. Those are the things that would be in normal urine. Before I talk about this bottom part, I want to go back to the picture. So the blood goes from the distal tubule into this bigger tube called the collecting duct. And notice there's places in here for other nephrons to dump their materials into. Because remember, you got millions of nephrons in your kidneys. They're all dumping into these collecting ducts. These collecting ducts will eventually dump the urine into this big funnel-shaped part of the kidney here. That's kind of hard to see underneath all these blood vessels. But right in here is almost like a big funnel head. You can see it right in there. That area, that big funnel-shaped part of the kidney there, is called the renal pelvis. And I already said that renal means kidney. Why is that called the renal pelvis? Look at the picture. Where's your pelvis? Right here, right? It's where your legs connect in. What is this right here look an awful lot like? It looks like what joint in your body? What do we call this joint? Your hip joint, right? It looks like where what's your main leg bone called? the femur. It looks like where your femur joins the pelvis. That's why it's called the renal pelvis, because it looks like your hip joint. But essentially what it is, it's a big funnel. All those collecting ducts will dump their urine into this big funnel-shaped renal pelvis, and then it will leave the kidney, and it'll go into the ureter. And from the ureter, it goes to the bladder, and from the bladder, it goes to urethra, and from the urethra, it goes out and leaves your body. So again, in post-secretion, the urine from those ducts eventually collects in the renal pelvis, leaves the kidney to the ureter, to the bladder, to the urethra, and then eventually out. And again, that's post-secretion. And then the very last thing we will say on this PowerPoint, over and over again, I want to stress to you that the main thing your kidneys do is osmoregulation, regulating water and salt balance in your body fluids. Osmoregulation. If you drink a lot of water, your urine comes out looking like what? Clear, almost clear. Really, really diluted. If on the other hand, you haven't been drinking a whole lot and you've been exercising, urine comes out really dark, right? It's about conserving water, maintaining homeostasis of salts and water inside your body. That's what your kidneys do. Again, this is a really important statement right here. The kidneys ensure that the composition of our blood remains constant. Homeostasis of your blood. That's the main job of the kidneys. And one of the things that help them do that, this came up the other day, is as a hormone called ADH. And we talked about ADH in here several times before. What gland in your body makes it? The pituitary, right there in the middle of your brain. And ADH, antidiuretic hormone, when is your body going to release a lot of that into the bloodstream? When you don't have enough to drink, when you're exercising a lot, you're sweating, maybe you're walking through a desert, you're really sweating, you're not drinking. It's about conserving your body's water. Now, like any hormone, how does ADH get around? Through the blood. So it leaves the pituitary, it goes directly into the bloodstream, so it travels to your whole body. Can ADH talk to the cells in your fingers? No. Why can't it talk to them? They don't have the right receptor for it. The only place in your body that I know of that has receptors for ADH are parts of your nephrons. In particular, it talks here about the cells of the tubules, the proximal and distal tubules, and also the collecting ducts. And what ADH causes to happen there is it makes the walls of those tubes be really permeable to water. So that the water that's in those tubes ends up doing what? The water that's in those, let's go back to the picture here for a second. The water that's inside these yellow tubes, if you're really dehydrated, do you want it to ever make it out? So you want it to go from the tube back to where? To the blood. ADH makes these tubes be really permeable to water so the water can leave. They can come out back to the blood before it goes out through your urinary stream. So it helps you to maintain your water supply. Conserve water when water is short. All right, any questions on that? All right, here's what we're going to do with our last couple of minutes. Let me get this stopped first.